Hello, and welcome to another video in my Fundamentals of Orchestration series. In my last video, I introduced the Orchestral Woodwinds section of the symphony orchestra and discussed the flute family in detail. Today will be a very short video where I take a look at the oboe family and discuss range, timbre, technique, and idiomatic writing. Let's get started. The oboe family consists of the oboe, the English horn, the oboe d'amore, the Heckelphone, the oboe da caccia, as well as the bass oboe, the piccolo oboe, and the contrabass oboe. All of these instruments are double reed woodwinds, which means that sound is produced by vibrating air between two reeds, typically made from cane wood or a synthetic material. Most oboes are made from wood and have a slightly conical bore. This means that the diameter of the oboe gets larger from top to bottom, unlike the flute, which has a cylindrical bore. For brass and woodwind instruments, whether an instrument is conical or cylindrical can tell us a lot about the tone and character of that instrument. I'll discuss this in more depth when I cover brass instruments in a future video. Partly because of the conical bore, the oboe and its family members are more easily heard over orchestral textures. They have a more piercing timbre, even in the middle registers. I'd like to spend some time discussing in depth a few of the individual instruments within the oboe family, starting with the soprano oboe, or simply the oboe. The oboe is an extremely lyrical and expressive double-reeded instrument with a range of B-flat-3 to G6. The lowest fifth of its range is heavy, less agile, and considered less lyrical and delicate than the rest of its range. Notes in this range tend to stick out of a woodwind texture, so it's good to be aware of the timbral qualities of this register before orchestrating your music in that range. The middle register, roughly the notes inside the treble clef staff, is warm, reedy, and clear. Unlike the concert flute, this register is most common for orchestral oboe writing, as it can project well in this range with a full sound. In this example, listen for the timbral shift between registers. The oboe starts in its lowest register, then briefly ascends through the middle register before returning. The low register is quite intense, and the middle register is much more clear and graceful. The notes above the treble clef staff are a bit thinner, but are clear and expressive. The highest notes, above E6, are less effective for orchestral writing. This example demonstrates the oboe moving from the middle register to its higher register, where the timbre thins out a bit, but still is very expressive and lyrical. The oboe is capable of many of the same agile passages as flute, with the exception of extremely fast tongued notes and repeated notes in quick succession. Double tonguing and triple tonguing are possible, but more difficult than on flute, and large leaps at a fast tempo are difficult, but possible. Trills and tremolos are fine, with half and whole step trills being much easier than larger intervals. As far as extended techniques go, rarely, if ever, do you see oboe extended techniques in orchestral writing, so things like multiphonics and microtonal writing are better suited for solo and chamber music. The second most common member of the oboe family is the English horn, tuned in F, with a written range from B3 to G6, and because it sounds a fifth below written pitch, the sounding range is E3 to C6. Unlike the oboe, the English horn has a very effective low register with a warm and rich timbre. The middle register sounds more like the oboe with a reedier, thinner timbre. The highest register, like the highest notes of the oboe, is very thin and not as effective in orchestral writing. In this example, listen to how the timbre changes with the highest notes. You can certainly hear the tone thin quite a bit here. It's a nice sound, but much weaker. In terms of idiomatic writing and technique, most of the same strengths and limitations of the oboe apply to the English horn. As was true with the flute family, in general, the larger the instrument, the slower the response time for the sound, and therefore certain techniques are more difficult. Any virtuosic passage or things like double or triple tonguing will likely be harder on the English horn than on the oboe. In modern orchestral writing, the oboe and the English horn are used quite frequently, while the other members of the family are either rare or extremely rare. One of them, however, the bass oboe, can be found in several important 20th century orchestral works, including Holst's The Planets. The bass oboe, or sometimes referred to as baritone oboe, has a written range from A3 to E6 and sounds an octave lower. It has the same range as the Heckelphone and a very similar timbre. It essentially rounds out the oboe family in the baritone range. This example demonstrates the overall sound and color of the bass or baritone oboe, as well as the timbral shifts between registers. The lowest notes are especially intense and rich, while the highest notes are thin and more fragile. Unfortunately, like the bass flute, this is yet another instrument that orchestral players rarely have access to. Other oboe variations include the oboe d'amore, which fits in registrally between the oboe and English horn, the oboe da caccia, which was primarily used in the Baroque era, the Heckelphone, which is similar to the bass oboe as I mentioned, the piccolo oboe, which is the highest pitched member of the oboe family, and the contrabass oboe, which is either pitched 2 octaves below the standard oboe or an octave and a half. While the oboe d'amore and oboe da caccia are still used on occasion in solo or chamber works, they are rarely used in orchestral settings, while the others are even more rare. I'd love to share some demonstrations of the timbre of each of these, but unfortunately I don't own any sample library versions of these instruments. That's all for this video. Stay tuned for more videos on the woodwind family, including clarinets and bassoons, as well as videos on orchestrating music for the woodwind section. See you next time.